Hi again, welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we saw how Denmark defied all odds and reacted to the catastrophes of the first years of the 1800s by having a golden age of culture and science that lasted for half a century. But there was one thing missing. Even though so many aspects of society developed and progressed, the political system in Denmark hadn't changed one bit. The country was still ruled by an absolute monarch who called all the shots. Today, the Danes will try to change that. Episode 130, Hope Springs Eternal. As you may remember from episode 97, in the year 1660, in the wake of the catastrophic loss in the war that had led to Sweden taking over all Danish lands east of the Øresund Strait, King Christian IV had forced through something of a constitutional coup in Denmark. He made himself an autocrat, a monarch with absolute power, supposedly granted to him by God himself. Back then, the emerging Danish middle classes had played a crucial role, supporting the king in his takeover of the government. They liked him. Not only had Christian IV been a ruler who understood and benefited the bourgeoisie and their economic interests, it had also been a way for the burghers to curb the power of the aristocracy, whom they did not like. Absolutism meant administrative efficiency, a limitation of aristocratic privileges, and the equality of all the king's subjects, at least in theory. But now, 150 years later, absolutism had lost some of its appeal. It had turned out that giving one man unlimited power could also have its downsides. It did in no way guarantee an efficient and trustworthy administration. An autocratic system was never better than the autocrat at the top, and if he was weak, uninterested, or incompetent, his government would shockingly be just as corrupt and inefficient as a state dominated by the nobility. Other, more efficient forms of government had emerged. Other systems that worked better, not only, but perhaps primarily, in taking care of the economic interests of the bourgeoisie. The Glorious Revolution in Britain, the establishment of the United States, and the French Revolution had proven as much. So now, in the early 1800s, educated people in Europe no longer saw an absolute monarch who supposedly had received his power and authority directly from God as the ideal form of government. Instead, it had become fashionable to see the people as the source of legitimacy and authority, and the people, not God, granted that power to its leaders. In 1815, at the Congress of Vienna following Napoleon's defeat, the winners from Waterloo had tried their best to put the ghost of democracy and popular sovereignty back in its box, but they weren't able to stop it, merely delay it by a generation or so. Throughout these tumultuous years, Denmark had been ruled by Frederick VI. We've met him before, but just for context, here's a brief recap. Frederick had a rough childhood. His father was crazy King Christian VII, and his mother, Caroline Matilda, neglected him in favor of her lover, John Frederick Struensee, who had a brief but exceptionally successful career both as the Queen's lover and the King's advisor and right-hand man. But when that brief career came to an end, he was executed and the Queen, Caroline Matilda, was exiled, leaving young Freddie even more alone than before. Perhaps his father, or rather his father's advisors, should have paid more attention to the Crown Prince, because on April 14th, 1784, when he was still only 16 years old, he staged a coup, encouraged by some disgruntled former members of his father's inner circle. 10 days before, Frederick had been confirmed, which also meant he technically was a legal adult now. The young adult prince tricked his father into signing a piece of paper, making him, Frederick, the regent of Denmark, the man holding all the absolute power that God was supposed to have vested in the king. One of the first things he did with his new power was to dismiss the advisors loyal to his grandmother, the Dowager Queen, who had been running the show by manipulating the mentally ill king. Then, for 24 years, until his father's death in 1808, Frederick ruled Denmark as regent. Even though he rose to power in a rather underhanded way, the change at the top was popular in Denmark. People had high expectations of the teenager who now governed the kingdom. This was something of a novelty for the Danes. Frederick's father was crazy, and his grandfather had been deeply unpopular for reasons we covered in episode 106. And as regent, Frederick got off to a flying start, doing his best to fulfill the expectations of his subjects. He introduced a number of reforms that were popular among the so-called enlightened despots at the time, that is, crowned heads who wanted to improve the lives of their subjects, but weren't willing to let said subjects themselves decide what was good for them. Still, it's hard to argue against the abolition of serfdom, which Frederick took care of in 1788. In 1803, he also outlawed slavery in the Danish colonies, thereby seriously undermining the economic viability of these overseas possessions. He also introduced a bunch of other economic and agrarian reforms that had positive effects for the Danish people and the Danish economy. For instance, he introduced universal basic education, more or less eradicating illiteracy in Denmark. We could talk a lot about these reforms, and we will, just not today. We'll get back to it in a future episode, and now we'll focus on the political side of things instead. Because in terms of politics, precious little changed during Frederick's time at the helm. Denmark advanced culturally and economically, sure, but not politically. No doubt Frederick VI wanted what was best for the Danes. He actively tried to improve their lives, but he didn't introduce any political reforms. He didn't want them to have any political power. He was fully convinced that he was the one who was put on this earth by God to rule Denmark, alone. Frederick was no fan of Bernadotte, but he did share the Marshal-turned-king's assessment of the French Revolution. The goings-on in France had scared Frederick away from liberalism, and he felt the revolution provided a far too threatening template for what could happen if you gave regular people political power. But as long as everything else was improving, people didn't make too much of a fuss about the wave of liberty and revolution passing Denmark by. There were exceptions, sure, and I've already mentioned the censorship was tightened during these years, but whatever dissatisfaction was brewing under the surface, it never seriously threatened Frederick's position. During the crises of the early 19th century, when the Brits showed up twice to flex their military muscle and attack Denmark unprovoked, the civilian government didn't impress. A good example of this is the crisis of 1807, when the British Navy showed up and started their infamous bombardment of Copenhagen. When the hostilities started, Frederick was in Kiel, inspecting the southern border, ironically making sure the French wouldn't be able to invade. As soon as he heard about the British attack, he started to prepare for a rescue of the capital. He assumed that the city would be able to withstand the Brits for 3 months. At least he hoped so, because that was the time he needed to prepare the counterattack. When the city capitulated after only 3 days, Frederick was aghast and blamed the burghers of Copenhagen for the failure. This did not go down particularly well with the inhabitants of the capital, who felt Frederick was grossly underestimating what they'd gone through during the British onslaught. They resented that Frederick called their patriotism into question, framing it as if they had failed their duty to defend the capital. In their opinion, it was he, the supreme commander of the armed forces, who had fumbled. Frederick, who by then had just replaced his father as king, did not see it that way. He drew the conclusion that he should rely more on the military instead of the civilian leadership. In the following years, Frederick VI showed a preference for his top military men and took their advice over that of his civilian advisors in questions concerning the government of his shrinking realm. His preference was even concretely manifested in the way he dressed. Frederick VI would typically walk around in military uniform, something previous Danish kings hadn't done. This did nothing to bridge the growing divide between the king and the Danish bourgeoisie. As the king and the leading circles of his subjects were drifting apart, Frederick became not only less popular, but also less open and friendly. He seemed to have undergone something of a personality change. He was less interested in reform and more in reaction, safeguarding what he had, not risking anything by easing the grip. But this change didn't last. After a few years, King Frederick tried to rectify the situation to get in with the burghers again. But he didn't do so by introducing any of the liberal political reforms they wanted. Instead, he tried to repair the relationship with the elites among his subjects in the most conservative way possible. He expanded the orders of chivalry to include more civilian recipients, awarding medals and honors not only for martial achievements, but also loyal service and achievements in arts, science, industry, and trade. And as we saw last time, Denmark was going through a golden age of art, literature, and science, so there were a lot of worthy candidates to pin medals to. Frederick VI hoped to tie the bourgeoisie to him through this new award system, but it mostly failed because of politics. He waged wars to save his crowns, and the wars hurt the merchants, tanking the economy. Foreign trade was impossible as long as Denmark was at war with the United Kingdom, so one after the other, the merchants of Copenhagen went bankrupt. In 1813, the state itself followed suit. As you know, the war not only bankrupted the state, it also brought about the loss of Norway. Just a few years before, Frederick's cousin, Gustav IV Adolf of Sweden, had been toppled for losing Finland. This precedent must have made Frederick nervous. To prop up his throne, Frederick VI wholeheartedly supported the so-called Holy Alliance that was formed following the fall of Napoleon. The alliance, which was an agreement between the three absolute monarchs of Austria, Prussia, and Russia, was signed in Paris in September 1815. Officially, the alliance was a pledge made by the King of Prussia and the Emperors of Austria and Russia to act on the basis of justice, love, and peace in order to avoid another devastating war like the Napoleonic Wars. But the real purpose of this arch-conservative, even reactionary alliance was to rein in the idea of liberalism and democracy. The rulers in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg wanted to make sure that autocracy and absolute monarchy would regain its supreme position on the European political stage. Beyond the efforts to fight the trend to give their subjects more rights and political power, the three signatory monarchs wanted to counteract nationalism. They all governed multi-ethnic empires, and it would be catastrophic if the various peoples within their borders would develop stronger feelings of solidarity with their compatriots instead of the dynasty that ruled them all. The agenda of the Holy Alliance was well aligned with the interests of King Frederick of Denmark. He had two main goals at this point. First, avoid implementing liberalizing political reforms that the Danish bourgeoisie was demanding, and second, keep his multi-ethnic realm together. That meant fostering patriotism, rallying around the king and dynasty, counteracting the growing nationalist movements among Danes and Germans that threatened to tear what was left of his kingdom to pieces. But I don't want to give you the wrong idea. The bourgeoisie might have been getting increasingly exasperated with the stifling political climate in Copenhagen, but they weren't ready to revolt against the crown, at least not quite yet. Also, Frederick VI still largely enjoyed the loyalty of the state bureaucracy. The administration still supported the absolute monarchy, even though a self-understanding of importance was starting to grow stronger among the civil servants. These well-educated men, largely recruited from the bourgeoisie, weren't blind to what was happening in Norway, where their colleagues had more or less taken over the running of the country. Just like their Norwegian counterparts, they saw themselves as the backbone of Denmark and felt that they should have a greater say in the making of policy, not just in carrying it out. As I've hinted at several times already, the conservative reaction after the fall of Napoleon was only able to slow down the political changes that were coming, not to stop them. In July 1830, Paris once again erupted in revolutionary chaos when the restored Bourbon king, Charles X, went too far in his attempts to reclaim pre-revolutionary power. Last time, we spoke about how these events shook the Swedes, and especially the French-born king on the throne in Stockholm, but they also rattled Copenhagen. By now, much of the energy had fizzled out of the Holy League. Its main architect, the Russian Tsar Alexander I, had died, and faced with the threat of spreading unrest, the King of Denmark realized that he had to do something. So the king announced that consultative regional assemblies would be established throughout his realm. One in Holstein, one in Schleswig, one in Jutland, and one for the Central Islands. The members of these assemblies were still forbidden to discuss the absolutist system, and especially in Holstein, King Frederick did what he could to undermine the work of the assembly and make it as difficult as possible to establish a German self-administration in the duchy. But he had limited success. The assemblies still created a generation of politicians who were used to discussing how to run a state, in Holstein and elsewhere. Without giving too much away, I can say that it proved to be a useful political education for the future. At the same time, to keep things from falling apart completely, Frederick VI also tightened up the already pretty tight Danish censorship laws. And even though this may have silenced the public chatter, it didn't change anybody's mind. Behind closed doors, the increasingly annoyed bourgeoisie kept expressing their frustration and discontent, albeit in hushed tones. It took the liberal bourgeoisie in Denmark a few years, but in 1835 they had gathered enough courage, or had become sufficiently annoyed, that they put together a humble petition to the king, asking for the right to discuss politics more openly. Even though the petition attracted a lot of signatures, the king rejected it. He rebuffed his subjects with the infamous words, "We alone know what truly is best for the people and the state." The king may have believed it to be true, but it convinced very few of these subjects. Still, as long as Frederick VI was alive, no one challenged the political system in any serious manner. By now, few members of the bourgeoisie wishing for political influence, or at least the right to express their opinions freely, remembered a time when he hadn't been in charge. Frederick had ruled Denmark for more than half a century, first as regent and then as king. People had gotten used to him. And it wasn't like he was a brutal dictator. He'd proven time and again that he wanted to improve the lot of his subjects, just as long as they stayed subjects. But no one lives forever, and in December 1839, King Frederick VI drew his last breath. In a move jam-packed with symbolism, the old beloved king was carried to his tomb in Roskilde Cathedral, the traditional final resting place of Danish monarchs, not by soldiers, but by the sons and the grandsons of the serfs that he had liberated at the beginning of his reign. But once the funeral was over, his successor and half-cousin, Christian VIII, had to face all the frustration and longing for political freedom that the Danes had kept in check out of respect for old King Frederick. To begin with, the Danes had high hopes when Christian VIII ascended the throne. You know the new king under the name Christian Frederick, and he starred in the episodes about the Norwegian attempts to establish independence and their writing of the most liberal constitution in Europe in 1814. Now, Danish liberals hoped, no, expected their new king to brush aside the stifling climate of Frederick VI and do for them what he'd done for the Norwegians 25 years before. But what the Danes didn't know was that Christian had never really wanted the Eidsvoll constitution. He'd agreed to it because that was the only way he'd get the Norwegian crown. Besides, a quarter of a century had passed since then, and Christian had grown increasingly conservative with time, as is so often the case. Now, when absolute power over Denmark had been handed to him on a silver platter, he wasn't prepared to give it up. Christian VIII had more or less the same goal as his predecessor had. He wanted to keep his realm together and avoid political turmoil by conserving the status quo. It would take all his political skill to manage to keep his freedom-seeking subjects from rocking the boat, though. Already at Frederick's funeral, the new King Christian made it clear to the Russian ambassador that he had no intention of changing anything and that the alliance with St. Petersburg remained firm. Not long thereafter, he made this intention public as well. Even though academics and regular people showered him with requests for a constitution, Christian VIII rejected their petitions, making it clear that he would only entertain administrative reforms, not limiting royal absolutism. The new king's attitude was met with surprise, disappointment, and even anger from the Danes. People showed their displeasure the following year when the king and queen celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Even though there were a lot of people out and about in the streets, the couple wasn't met by spontaneous cheers from the crowds, only stony silence. King Christian found this unsettling. It was an unpleasant surprise, since he'd expected more displays of love from his subjects. But Christian didn't draw the conclusion that he needed to change course in order to improve his popularity. Just like Frederick VI, the two ideas that scared Christian VIII more than anything else were nationalism and liberalism. The reason he feared nationalism, a force harnessed by so many other leaders wanting to strengthen their grip on power, was that Christian was the king of a multi-ethnic realm. Trying to rally people to the cause of the nation would split them, further widening the growing abyss that was opening up between Danes and Germans. After the loss of Norway in 1814, German speakers made up no less than 40% of the population in the realm of the Oldenburg monarchs. The lion's share of these German speakers lived in the duchies Schleswig and Holstein, which technically weren't part of Denmark, even though they'd been ruled by the king in Copenhagen for hundreds of years by now. For generations, this hadn't presented a problem, but now, with the growth of nationalism, German speakers were starting to ask why they should be governed by a Dane. It hadn't helped that the Duchy of Holstein had been admitted as a member of the newly established German Confederation at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The people of Holstein were getting increasingly fired up by German nationalism, and when Frederick VI had given them a regional assembly, that hadn't exactly stemmed feelings of separatism among the Germans under his rule. Christian VIII, much like Frederick VI before him, was convinced that the only thing that would be able to keep his realm together would be to foster a sense of loyalty to the crown and the Oldenburg dynasty among his subjects, making them forget, or at least ignore, that they were Danes or Germans. But his subjects weren't easy to convince. In Holstein, German liberals questioned the absolute monarchy, eagerly supported by liberals in the German Confederation. And the Germans weren't the only ones making trouble. Also in Denmark proper, liberals were causing the king sleepless nights, tugging in the opposite direction. They insisted on tying the duchies closer to Denmark, Danifying their administration and civil service. They wanted to establish a Danish hegemony throughout all of Christian's lands, including the duchies, or at least in Schleswig, which had a mixed Danish and German population. This created a seemingly unsolvable problem, where both German and Danish nationalists demanded that Schleswig should be either completely German or completely Danish, with no room for compromise. So Christian VIII had to deal with the double threat of liberalism and nationalism. Danish liberals wanted a freer unified state with reduced royal power, where the duchies, or at the very least Schleswig, would be incorporated into Denmark. The German liberals in Schleswig and Holstein also wanted a freer political system with reduced royal power, but at the same time they wanted the duchies to be free from Denmark and more closely tied to the new German Confederation. Tension between Danes and Germans grew, and the king tried to be neutral, insisting that the Dano-German mix was a blessing for the realm. Fewer and fewer people seemed to agree with him. As if Christian VIII didn't have enough to worry about, his family was also causing trouble. It had begun with his first wife, who also happened to be his cousin, Charlotte Friederike of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. To begin with, Christian had been pleased with her. She was beautiful, charming, and funny, but perhaps she was just a little too beautiful and charming, and she definitely didn't take her job seriously enough, because she took a lover, her French music teacher. When Christian found out, he divorced her. Quite the scandal. The rest of his life, Christian carried the trauma of having been cheated on. That unpleasant experience did not, however, mean that he resolved to be faithful to his second wife. Not even close. He had at least 10 children out of wedlock. Some people like to spread the rumor that the author Hans Christian Andersen was, in fact, one of Christian VIII's illegitimate children. According to that theory, Andersen's biological mother was Countess Elise Alefeld Lervig, who had an affair with the king and then gave up the boy for adoption to a couple in Odense. They like to point to the fairy tale about the ugly duckling as proof. Supposedly, it's Andersen's way of hinting that he, who stemmed from a swan egg, was forced to grow up among ducks. The theory is almost certainly nonsense, though. At any rate, there is not a shred of credible evidence whatsoever to back it up. Christian VIII only had one son within wedlock, and the boy was, of course, named Frederick. After his parents divorced in 1810, young Frederick was raised by a host of governesses, tutors and servants, but not by his parents. He was also sent abroad a few years to make sure he'd be properly disconnected from his family. In 1828, Frederick got married. Just like his father, he found a cousin to wed, and just like his father, Frederick's marriage ended in divorce. But this time, you can't really blame the wife. She just couldn't stand living with him because of his heavy drinking, violence, and general irregular lifestyle. And it wasn't like his cousin/wife was the only one who found Frederick's behavior intolerable. Already Frederick VI banished him to Iceland to try to get his life together. Later, he was allowed to return to Denmark, but he had to settle in Jutland, far away from Copenhagen. When Christian VIII became king in 1839, Frederick was appointed governor of the islands of Funen and commander of the armed forces in Jutland and Funen. Frederick was mighty pleased by this, but in exchange he had to marry again because the Oldenburgs were running critically low on male heirs, and King Christian was anxious to see the dynasty continue. So in 1841, Frederick married Mariana of Mecklenburg-Sterlitz, But also this marriage was childless and ended in divorce. Crown Prince Frederick wasn't just a heavy-drinking brute. He was also something of an ignoramus, because he'd never received a proper education. Seems like a pretty major oversight considering the job he was lined up to take over, but as I mentioned a moment ago, his parents weren't around much when he was growing up. But now, when Christian VIII was getting older, it was starting to dawn on him that there was a risk that his son and heir would not only be the end of the line of the Oldenburg dynasty, but that he would also make such a mess of being king that the realm might break apart. Christian decided that he needed to act to try and smooth the way for his incompetent son. That meant easing the pressure that was building in Danish society. Some people, even historians, like to describe Christian VIII as stubborn and clueless, a king who clung to power with increasing desperation, even though it was painfully obvious to everyone that he should have let go a long time ago. But I would argue that this is an unfair characterization. Christian VIII feared that liberal reforms would weaken the connection between Denmark and the duchies, Schleswig and Holstein. It was the crown and the dynasty that held the realm together. A constitution would inevitably drive a wedge between the kingdom and the duchies, running the risk of diminishing the Oldenburg realm even further than the loss of Norway already had. But now, in the early 1830s, King Christian concluded that he didn't have a choice. His incompetent drunkard of a son wouldn't be able to perform the delicate balancing act that Christian VIII himself and Frederick VI before him had been able to do. This was the time to introduce political reforms. Christian hoped he could still impose it from above, instead of having it forced upon him from below. So King Christian agreed to entertain the idea of gradual reforms to calm the waters. After all, both Prussia and Russia already had senates that advised their respective absolute monarchs, so maybe Denmark could have one too. But would it be enough to placate the people who wanted a constitution and an elected parliament? The idea was to gradually introduce reforms during Christian's own lifetime. He preferred to introduce the new system of government before he died, so that the political temperature would be nice and cool when it was time for incompetent Frederick to take over. Successions are always times of potential crisis, and Christian wanted to do what he could to make sure that the transition would be a smooth one when it was his time to go. He remembered the expectations when he himself had become king, and he shuddered to think how his son would handle such a challenge. In December 1847, a draft for a constitution for the unified realm, including the Kingdom of Denmark and the duchies Schleswig and Holstein, was ready. Christian VIII hoped that this document would create a stable framework for governing his realm in the generations to come. He was expecting to try out the new constitution and to stabilize Danish political life in the years he had left before his death. But Christian VIII never got to ease his realm into this new political reality. On January 9, 1848, only weeks after the constitution had been drafted, the king underwent a minor bloodletting procedure. Unfortunately, he contracted blood poisoning from the treatment and he fell seriously ill. When the king realized that he was actually going to die, he became really scared. He wasn't necessarily afraid of death, but he was absolutely petrified by the prospect of his incompetent son botching the job as absolute monarch and causing the downfall of everything Christian had spent his life trying to preserve. The dying king hurried to jot down a political testament for his son. He was convinced that if Frederick didn't have detailed instructions, he would fail as king, and the results would be catastrophic. In this document, Christian VIII urged his son to give the Danish people and the duchies a unified constitution. 11 days later, on January 20th, 1848, Christian VIII died of sepsis. He was 61 years old. The timing couldn't have been worse. Not only was the kingdom thrown into the crisis that Christian VIII had done so much to avoid, at the same time, Europe erupted in a new wave of revolutions known to history as the Spring of the Peoples, a violent reaction against 30 years of conservative repression in the wake of the Congress of Vienna. Next time, we'll see how new King Frederick handled all of this. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. via the Facebook page. You can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.